Thank you, Donna. It's tough reviewing somebody else's chapter, so thank you for doing that. So I think what we'd like to do now is we want to have the panel discussion about the recreation baseline chapter, and so we'll ask the panel members who are comfortable talking about that and feel that you have. Might be just Steve. Okay, and I will. Donna, we won't put you on the spot and put you up there unless you want to. But
oh, I have nothing to say.
Okay, and I'm going to put Steve's. Steve has a.
Actually, I don't really want to. Sort of load the PowerPoint if there's a way to not.
Yeah, can you?
Not show the.
Okay.
Sorry, I should have made a title.
Yeah, well, yeah, we'll go ahead and do that. Okay.
Will undoubtedly be distracted from me. Okay, good morning. First of all, I'd like to echo Todd's comment that it is very difficult to present someone else's work, and you did a very good job. And the second thing I'd like to say is that I also feel comfortable that you need to leave. I've tried to address my comments in a constructive and forward-looking way, and so they're probably addressed. Since Kevin Waring has retired, they're by definition addressed to some potential future consultant and to the Pebble people who might employ such resources. So I've boiled down my comments to about 4 or 5 points, and I'll try to make them quickly so we can have discussion either now or later. The first point is that I'd like to commend Kevin, and I guess you get commendation by association, Donna, for an excellent job of compiling the data sets on sport fishing and sport hunting and mapping them in a way that I think adds value to the underlying raw data. I expect that I and others will use this chapter in the future as a sort of a desk reference of some data that is easier to talk about than it is to actually marshal it all and to map it and present it. That is no small feat, and the authors deserve commendation for that. I will now move into what I guess would be more critical comments, but again, I'm going to try to phrase them in a way that's constructive suggestions for future work. My first comment is that while I recognize, and I think we all recognize, the limitations that were sort of set on the study in terms of no new primary data to be collected. I was disappointed that there was no or very little attempt to interpret some of the data that was presented, and by that I mean I think it would have been possible, or it would be possible in a future iteration of this work to check in with some of the professionals at Fish and Game, at the Park Service, and in the hunting and guiding and lodging industry for some expert or professional opinions about what these data mean. And one of the benefits of that approach would be that it would take the authors off the hook for making conclusions that were not necessarily justified by data. There was some discussion about that yesterday, the fine line between presenting what is and the minute you get into an outlook or a future-oriented discussion, you then you're in the muddy, sort of the gray zone between presenting data and then presenting your own opinions. But if you can record the opinions of others, to me, that is better science, because if science means one thing, it means replicability, or at least the potential to replicate. So that's a suggestion that if future iterations of this kind of a compilation of really reams of data about sport hunting and sport fishing resources and use of those resources could be, I think, augmented at very low cost with some practicing professionals' interpretation of the data. And then it can be left to the readers to weigh the validity of that. Can't help parenthetically stating that, because I'll forget it, that I would also urge future iterations to welcome rather than limit use of multiple data sources, even when they're in conflict. So there was discussion yesterday about census versus ADF&G, and I thought about this last night, and I came to a pretty strong conclusion that the best approach would be to have a big tent for these kinds of data and present both sets and let readers see, if nothing else, that the data do not all line up in perfect order. But that was somewhat of an aside. Okay, so moving on to point number 3, which is a somewhat of a segue from point number 2, which was to augment primary data with some expert interpretation of it. There are at least 2 examples where this, I think, is absolutely critical, and I hope it can be done somehow. The most important one that sort of hit me over the head was we have these, I even hesitate to call them trends, but there's no better word, for they're short-term trends measured from 1999 to 2005 typically in several indicators of harvest. So if you could show actually my second slide. It's an example. So this is fish, angler days and catch in the central study area, and this is just my own reproduction because the PDF data was locked and secured. I had to just retype the numbers from I think it's figure 25. Well, it says table 2525. So that's all this is a graph of that. But it's a very impressive decline, right? And it just left me longing for some kind of, for somebody to be quoted in the study as to what does this mean? Is this within the natural variability? If we push this trend back for 10 more years, would we see that this is mirrored by this downturn shown on the slide is mirrored by an upturn in previous years? And I was just longing for some kind of context or some kind of interpretation of this trend. And I think it goes without saying, and it's already been mentioned by Donna, that 2005 is almost ancient history, and so at a minimum we need, or I think we the public should expect to get some update from 2005 as close to the present as possible. But the main point is that there needs to be, I think, and I think there could be, some attempts to interpret this trend in fish. There's a similar trend in moose, which I didn't retype the data, but figure 2547 in the chapter clearly shows a similar, what I would call dramatic downturn in the moose harvest over the same 6-year period. And yesterday it was mentioned that you can see the same pattern for a caribou. And the numbers for the Bristol Bay drainage in Caribou are roughly 750 to 800, that kind of magnitude of a harvest. But the trend, the trend over this short time period is also significantly downward. So the data seem to be telling or wanting to tell three stories, but I really was hoping that there would be some kind of professional or expert interpretation of what those stories might be. Now let me turn to my final, really, 2 points, and they have to do with the economic significance of these resources and their use. And here, I guess I have some good news, which is that there has been a significant amount of new work done in trying to measure the economic importance of dispersed recreation and the park units in this region. So before I go on to sort of mention briefly some of this new work and the potential it has for contributing to a future iteration of this study, let me get a sort of a criticism out of the way so we can end positively. I already mentioned that it would be better to quote outside, meaning outside of the study team, outside experts and professionals interpreting data. And in some instances, this chapter not only fails to do that, but it appears to just substitute sort of uncited and unsupported conclusions by the authors themselves. So I will show you in a moment an example with data for Katmai National Park, but the two examples that stuck in my head are, one is a minor one. Let me just see if I can read it. I moved my chapter around to find the caribou data, so I have to go back here. Page 15, okay. So on page 15 of the chapter, page 25:15, this is discussing the Alaknak River and the Wild River corridor. Oh, okay, finally, it's at the bottom of the page. The Alaknak River it says, quote, the Alaknak River is the most productive fly-in sport fishery in southwest Alaska. Well, that part is supported by evidence, and you've seen some of it this morning, even in the presentation. And then it says, and the Alaknak River corridor is one of the region's most popular destinations. Well, I wanted to see data to support that. And I think there are other examples of this kind of ad hoc conclusion without the evidence that I could probably point to, because I noticed it at several places. The other place that I think I noticed it and was even more concerned was actually mentioned by Donna, and it relates to the economic contribution of the dispersed sport fishing industry and in particular the lodges. I would like to see evidence to support statements such as I'm just going to read you this conclusion because I think it's troublesome the way it appears. it says, quote, "Several factors diminish the lodge's contributions to the local economies. They are largely staffed by non-local or mostly non-Alaska resident service workers who are relatively low paid. This limits the lodge's contribution to resident earnings. Most supplies are purchased directly from non-local sources, limiting the boost the lodge's purchases give to the local suppliers. Moreover, most of the lodges are owned by non-residents of the region, so the profits of the proprietorship do not accrue to local residents or economy." Those to me seem like pretty important conclusions, and there is no data in this chapter to support them. So if the data exist, they should be in the chapter, and if the data don't exist, this statement needs to be modified or somehow toned down. The same concern of mine applies to the discussion of Katmai National Park and the contribution to the economy that it makes through visitor expenditures. And here I have another slide, be my slide number 1 in this case. The EBD chapter quotes a study by Professor Steins, who is commissioned by the Park Service to do economic significance or impact studies, and the one that's quoted in the EBD is apparently the one that he performed in 2007, covering the 2006 season. And I've summarized, I think without getting into further detail, there's some other indicators of economic activity in the EBD, namely expenditures and labor income. But here's the one that most people really care about. Average annual jobs is on my slide. The rightmost bar, the smallest one, is the number that Steins came up with and was reported in the EBD. And just for the record, let me state it. Okay, I believe this bar represents the number of 66 average annual jobs, which is quoted in the study based on $3.3 million of expenditures. And this number has always seemed, these kinds of numbers have always seemed low to those of us who've looked at them. And colleagues of mine have actually done significant new work to look at how Alaska parks are different and what the actual contributions of visitors are. And the numbers that they've come up with are shown in the two leftmost bars. The one on the far left represents contributions to the Alaska economy from visitors to Katmai spending money. And that number is, I believe, 647. Yes, 647 average annual jobs. And when you restrict the area of interest where you're measuring the employment down to basically the Southwest Alaska region, I think they used five contiguous boroughs, the number drops to just about 400, but it's still obviously almost 10 times as large as the 66 that was cited in the EBD. And another way of seeing how sort of troubling, well, that's not the right word, how uncomfortable both myself and colleagues have been with these traditional measures of economic impact of parks is if you take the visits number, which is reproduced in the EBD. It's from the Park Service, so I'm not faulting the authors of the chapter, but it's 68,690, I believe. If you take that visits number and you divide it into the reported $3.3 million of expenditures, little arithmetic here, if anyone wants to try it in their head, it's about $48 per visit. That just doesn't work for Katmai. You can get about 3 miles into your float plane trip and then you'd be ejected before when your $48 ran out. So that kind of reality check suggests that these published numbers as of 2006 really are very low. And again, the first message is not necessarily that one is right and one is wrong, but when there's a range this big from credible sources, it ought to be investigated further. But the more important message is that there's good news for future iterations of this work. There has been close attention paid to this particular park and this region, and there is new results about the economic significance of the parks, and it's based on solid new data and a very detailed analysis. And I will make the citations of all these several papers available to Todd for whatever final product we end up with. So that was a little bit long-winded, but I think it sort of summarizes several important things about sort of the state of play in recreation and recreation economics, namely that the data in the EBD in some sense raise important questions that they are unable to answer or were unable to answer at the time. But we may be much closer to being able to provide answers if a future iteration is done. And notwithstanding the fact that the data are still not definitive, I think it is fair to say that the chapter as written diminishes the role and the economic importance of national park visitation and of sport fishing activity. It diminishes the role of these sectors in the local economy in a way that is not supported by the data. And that's, I think, the most dispassionate way I can say this.
I have a quick question. When you're saying employment, is that local employment? I'm sorry. I just have a quick
Can you
question.
state your name?
My name is Jennifer Adelman. I spent several years working out in this area, specifically at Katmai. And I just have a question if by employment that's number of jobs or if that's local hire.
The 647 is average annual jobs statewide. So as you well know, if you just do, takes significant expenditures to visit Katmai, and you got to start spending when you're hundreds of miles away. So that's what that number is. It may or may not, it's obviously much higher, the 647, than local. The second number, which is 400, I probably mislabeled it. I probably should have said regional or something like that. Okay, I think we could have a long discussion about where does the region end and the local begin. But that, what I can say is that that's the number that came out of when they sort of confined they told the model to only report jobs that are occurring in a regional area that was, I believe it was five boroughs that would sort of be centered on the Katmai area.
Let me,
That's another question altogether. Yes. I don't know. I could find out. It should be in the paper.
so I think we want to let Steve finish, and then
Yeah.
we'll take a break, and then we'll bring him back up later on in the morning, and we ask more of these questions.
I think I basically am finished. But since I'm and I've tried to state my criticism, if you will, in terms of what could be done in a future iteration to improve the characterization of this this leads me to my final point. When you say recreation, are you talking about an activity, a resource, or what? I would urge any future iteration to try to integrate recreation and tourism fully into a description and a structural analysis of the regional economy, and to really recognize that this is an industry. It's an export industry, exporting into the world market. And I think that would help to put it into its proper context, and maybe it's a philosophical or a minor point what you call something, but I think in this case it is important, and so I would recommend as a final parting shot that in a future iteration this chapter be at the very least renamed Recreation and Tourism, and hopefully somehow integrated more seamlessly with other chapters on the economy. That's
Great.
it.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate that. So I think what we're going to do is we'll take a 15-minute break right now. When we come back, we'll have the other presentation on cultural resources. They don't entirely fit that well together, but we want to get both of them in. Then we'll bring the panel members up, and then we can ask those questions. So this is a little bit awkward, but we'll get to those questions. We certainly don't want to miss them. We've got some that have already come in from the web page. So that's the way we would prefer to do it. And I apologize because I know there are important questions that are going to come up, and I can see some people squirming a little bit, but. We will get to them. So let's take a 15-minute break, and we'll reconvene at a little after 10. Thank you.